The interesting thing there, just throw out a historical tidbit, the Frankfurt School itself, it's founded in 1923, and some of the original participants at its seminar, there's a Marxist German philosopher by the name of Karl Marx, and he gives a paper, which still exists, we have a record of it from 1923, where he is celebrating the fact that Lenin has reinfused Marxism with a revolutionary vigor. Now, Korsch later turns on Lenin and says, well, that's the wrong way to implement Marxism, but he credits Lenin explicitly with restoring the revolutionary vigor that jumpstarts his project, which inspires the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School also is a recipient of some of those early ventures of the Soviet government when they're trying to fund the collected works of Karl Marx and all these translation projects. There's a collaborative project that emerges between them and the Soviet Union on propagating Marx's his work. So I guess this is a roundabout way of saying is if you ask a critical theorist today, they'll say, yes, we're adherents of Marxism, but not that Orthodox Marxism on class grounds, and we're certainly not connected to the Soviet Union. And what I'm saying is, well, you kind of are. You owe your intellectual tradition and your history to the fact that Lenin put Marx on the map. And even though you diverged from Lenin and you split from that as the strategy in the 1920s and 1930s as you started to see some of the problems that were emerging there, the Frankfurt School, the Western Marxist tradition, really does get its jump start in the aftermath of the Soviet Union.
That's very interesting. And I would like to learn more about the Frankfurt School, but maybe we can table that for another discussion. But what I'd like to get into now is your research. So what exactly did you guys do, and how did you do it, and what did you find?
Yeah. So we had been studying all of these observations from contemporaries between about 1883 and the 1910s that keep commenting on how Marx is this really obscure guy. And they come from across the political spectrum. So one of the main ones that we found, Frederick Copleston writes this monumental history of philosophy, basically from the ancient world to the modern day. It's one of the great multi-volume works of the 20th century from a British academic that's it's really well regarded. It's a fun read itself if you've got the time. But he has an interesting chapter on Karl Marx, and he points out in that chapter, he says, if the Russian Revolution had not turned out the way that it did, and I'm paraphrasing here, Karl Marx might just be some obscure 19th century footnote in the history of philosophy. So I'm reading it, and I'm like, that's really interesting. And then you start to see this observation made by multiple other people. Ludwig von Mises and Thomas Sowell, the free market economists, both make this observation in their works about Marx. But so do figures on the political left. I mentioned W.B. Du Bois made this observation. H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, who's also a democratic socialist theorist in the UK, he makes a very similar observation. And it turns out there are dozens upon dozens of people saying that it's essentially the Soviet Union that put Karl Marx on the map. And we're looking at these and we start thinking, this might be empirically testable. We now have massive databases of tens of millions of pages of scanned text that go together. It's the corpus that makes up the Google Books library. And what they have done is, going back to the 1500s up until the present day, they go and scan university libraries with text recognition software and digitize them. So it's a great, massive undertaking. It's one of the largest data sets of its sort that's probably conceivably in existence in human history. They have various estimates that say they've probably scanned somewhere between 10 to 20% of all books that have ever been written in various forms, depending on the language that you're looking at. But it's a massive project, and Google put together this database, essentially. They made it available to the public. It's called the Ngram Reader. And a Google Ngram is you can find the number of times that a particular word or type of text or name is used in a given year in history. So I can look up the year 1873 and I can find the number of times Karl Marx is mentioned as a percentage of all books that are scanned and published in 1873. And you can do that for almost any author, whether it's Plato, Aristotle, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Martin Luther King, John Locke, you name it. You go across the entire corpus of intellectual history of who are the major figures, and you can see how it changes over time. So I think this is a really interesting database. It's a neat tool. What can we do in this empirically? So I'm talking with Michael one evening and had shown him some of the Ngram data I had collected on Karl Marx, and you see he's kind of piddling along until 1917, and then he skyrockets, just takes off. I was like, aha, there's something interesting happening here. This is clearly a response to the Russian Revolution. But can we demonstrate that? Can we prove it empirically? So there's a new statistical technique, relatively new, it's come up in the last half decade or so, called the synthetic control method. And basically what it does is you create an input of a very large database, and you run it through statistical software. We basically have a supercomputer that we created basically for this purpose of running these types of other types of very sophisticated models. And you load hundreds of thousands of data points into it potentially. It's a very, very large data sets. We studied 226 different authors across the intellectual canon from the ancient world to roughly the time Karl Marx is writing. And of that, you get the number of pages they appeared in a given year in Google Ngram. So you put that all into a massive database. What the computer does is it algorithmically fits a subset of those authors to the known trend line of Karl Marx's citations before 1917. And you actually get a really, really tight fit. And what you can do so it would take like all of the authors in our database from, let's say, 1880 to 1916, and they try to get the tightest fit possible to mirror the actual trend line of Karl Marx. And once you've got that line, you can project it forward because now you know the weights of all those other authors.
So these are comparables. They're comparable
Exactly.
authors. Yes,
So
yes,
you've got a
yes.
counterfactual history that shows, well, all of these people matched Karl Marx up until 1916. Let's assume the Russian Revolution never occurs and Marx just continues to follow that matched pattern. And now we see our counterfactual. And then the empirical test is to see if the divergence from that counterfactual is statistically significant. And it turns out it is in very, very strong and pronounced ways. So that's the result in our paper. We find that after 1917, Marx undergoes what we refer to as a statistical treatment. His citations skyrocket. Meanwhile, the fit citations of the synthetic control continue at that much, much lower level pattern that fit the other authors that composed it. Now we can dig into who those other authors are, and it turns out synthetic Karl Marx is built up, he matches most closely with all of these other competitor socialists from the mid to late 19th century that he feuded with and hated. So it's
Wow.
Johann Karl Rodbertus and Ferdinand Lassalle are the two biggest components, the donors to synthetic Marx, which makes sense because in the 19th century, these are guys that are competing for that same far left fringe of the political sphere, that same radical labor movement contingent, and they're feuding with each other for a very small segment of society, but in very intense ways. And it turns out that the people that are closest to Marx that do not experience the treatment, they are not elevated by the Soviet Union. Lenin has no interest in turning Lassalle into like this great model for building society. He only focuses on Marx. So when Marx diverges from a synthetic counterfactual built of these other socialist contemporaries, we've got pretty clear evidence that it's Lenin and the Bolsheviks that are pushing Marx into academic salience. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude here, Marx's citations basically triple overnight as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. And we trace this through about the next decade or so, because now you start to have intervening events. But at least throughout the 1910s and 20s, after this event occurs, Marx is just skyrocketing. Whereas all these other socialists are piddling along at the same pre-treatment level that our synthetic Marx showed.
So their names are Lassalle. What are the other ones?
Yeah, Rodbertus.
And
So Ferdinand Lassalle and Johann Karl Rodbertus are the two main components. You also see other 19th century figures. So there's a smidgen of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who's another socialist competitor in that era. You also get a little bit of Oscar Wilde and then Abraham Lincoln, who are just prominent 19th century thinkers that filter into that. But it's like the lion's share of the composite comes from these other relatively obscure but contemporary 19th century socialists that were competitors to Marx.
well, the reason I asked you for their exact names is because aside from Oscar Wilde, Does anybody know who these people are? Because I don't. I've never heard these names
That's
before, right? And so that kind of creates the point on its own, is that he might have been as obscure as them. But it's also possible that one of these would have replaced, if Lenin had picked up
that's
somebody
entirely
else
the case.
instead of Marx, right? Like, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
necessarily that the Russian Revolution wouldn't have happened, right?
right, right. And there's theoretical what ifs of history. I don't want to get too far down that path, but what if
Yeah.
Rodbertian socialism had emerged as the dominant socialist school rather than Marxian socialism? Well, we can go back and look at Robertus's ideas, and it turns out he is not interested in the violent revolutionary upheaval that Marx celebrates.
Hmm.
Same with Ferdinand Lassalle. Lassalle tries to achieve his reforms through legislative means and elections. So you get these other far less violent socialists. So maybe the system wouldn't have worked. It may have been an economic basket case. It almost certainly would have been because the underlying theory is wrong. But at least it's stripped of this genocidal tendency that seems to be infused with Marxism every time that it's attempted to be acted upon.